Okay. Don't typically talk during my videos. They're usually just, shots of me flying different planes or different creations I've made. But this particular creation, the modified Airhogs X-Wing, there are a lot of people asking for some sort of mod guide or tutorial. So I'm going to go through kind of an overview of how I made it. Not necessarily really delving into soldering things together, but kind of list the components where things fit, and a general description of why I did most of the things. Before I get into that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the stock toy and some of the design decisions that I think went into this one. There's some interesting parts of it, so we'll put this guy aside for now. So what we've got here is the Airhogs X-Wing by Spin Master. It was released about a month ago during the big Force Friday launch. I picked up one of the stock ones. I actually picked up two so I could leave one stock and modify one. Like most of the Airhogs offerings over the past decade or so, it's a two-channel aircraft that has all the controls provided by the two motors on the bottom. So the motors provide throttle that is kind of coupled to give you pitch control, and then it uses differential thrust for yaw. Just looking at it out of the box, it's actually a pretty amazing mold. So it's pretty well scaled, obviously with the exception of the canard and the kind of goofy nacelles. The rest of it really looks like an X-Wing. They did some really great detailing work. There's all the little panel lines, there's weathering, the markings are all pretty good. The color is a bit off, but for a toy, it's pretty nice. They cheated a bit, where instead of being a pure flying wing, they got the canard up here. And I think that they did that mostly just because it'd be pretty hard to fly it as just two channels as a flying wing. The CG margin would be really small, and having the canard really lets it be a little more docile in pitch. So typically the way these things work is that the canard is supposed to stall before the main wing, so if it gets bumped nose up, the canard will stall and drop the nose back down. When I first saw it, I thought that they might have originally intended to have 4 ducted fans and then dropped to 2 for some sort of cost savings. But it looks like after I took apart their first one that there isn't actually enough clearance in these top ones to fit another set of fans. My guess is that they kept these large just so that they didn't look out of place with the large lower nacelles, but also I think they're using these as the vertical stabilizers. So there's a fair amount of vertical surface area here that they're using to provide the yaw stability of the aircraft. The CG is actually right at the back of the canopy thereabouts. So these are actually pretty far behind the CG. A couple of interesting bits on here. So since it's just two-channel, it needs to be somewhat stable in roll. So if it gets blown by a gust of wind or something, it needs to be able to self-right. Typically that's done through dihedral, which is angling of the wings. But since this is an X-Wing and not a V-Wing, they have dihedral up here and anhedral down here. So that would make it neutrally stable in roll. The way they got around that is actually the lower wing is symmetrical, so there's no camber on the lower wing, and the top wing is cambered and also at a slightly higher angle of attack. So the top wing is actually producing the vast majority of the lift for this aircraft, and so it's providing the dihedral effect. So that's where you get your roll stability out of. One of the big misses I think on this is typically for canards to work properly, they're supposed to stall before the main wing. But looking at most people's problems in flying this, it happens on launch. And in those cases, it looks like the canard is not stalling, the main wing stalling, and then because of this low thrust line, they're getting a really large pitch-up moment from the high throttle, and so that's causing the aircraft just to flip on its back. You can get it flying reasonably well if you're careful with the throttle setting and you got a big open space and there's not much wind. But out of the box, it's really kind of disappointing. It looks beautiful, but it doesn't fly that great. So I'll pull out the other aircraft and walk through kind of some of the main changes I did to get it flying nicely. Alright, so this is my version of the Airhogs X-Wing that actually flies reasonably well. It's not really aerobatic or a sports car by any means, but it does fly, and you can do nice left and right hand turns, banks. It flies reasonably well in a much smaller space than the stock one. A couple of things you'll notice right off the bat is that mine does not have much of a canard. Mine also does not have the ducted fans, and mine has ailerons where the other aircraft has no control surfaces. The big kind of difference here is that this aircraft has control over all three axes. So you have roll, pitch, and yaw control through the ailerons and the differential thrust, and you have proportional throttle control through the two motors. Where ducted fans are cool in that they look like little jet engines, but at this scale they're super inefficient. So these motors put out more than twice the thrust of these motors, and they're smaller motors and they consume less power. So for something this big and draggy, if you want it to fly nicely, you need to provide it with enough thrust. To me, the canard was kind of cheating. And so I wanted to see if we could make it without the canard, which I mostly got to that. There's still a little bit of a strake here that lets me run just a slightly more forward CG. But it's mostly gone. It looks much more like an X-Wing. But I think for most people, probably leaving the canard on is the right choice, and it'll just make it easier to fly. So, other than that, there's not really much to it. Because I got rid of the canard and the center of gravity moved much further aft, the aircraft became unstable in yaw, so I had to add on these little kind of cheater fins in the back to provide the yaw stability. If you left the canard on, you probably wouldn't need these. So, I'll open up the aircraft and kind of go over how I split things open and then what all the components are. Alright, so here we have the aircraft opened up. There is a seam that runs the whole length of the side of the aircraft that if you get a straight edge razor blade or any other nice cutting blade, you can just run it straight along there, cut through the glue line, and then peel the aircraft into two pieces relatively easily. There are similar lines on all of the nacelles, so down here you'll see there's a similar part line there and there. You can cut that and then easily pull this part off and remove the fans. The receiver unit sits right here, and then the battery sits up here. You can see the battery cavity on this part over here. You want to be really careful as you're pulling that out. Just kind of work the knife along the sides of the electronics, and you can kind of, it's held in with the like a contact cement type of deal, so you can kind of peel away the cement and pull the piece out. You want to be really careful anytime you're working around lithium polymer batteries. Don't poke it with the knife because it does pose a fire risk. So PSA on all lithium battery handling: always be extra careful with stuff like that. So once you have it open, you can rip out all the stock electronics, and you're left with a relatively nice shell with tons of room to put in your components. In this particular video, I'm not going to go through, soldering the individual parts together. You don't need to be a soldering expert, but anytime you're working with, stuff of this scale, having a good soldering iron, something that is temperature controlled, really helps things with a relatively fine tip. I'll put a link in the description box of all the components I used. This is using kind of higher end micro RC stuff, but I have an alternate combo which would use components out of a little 2-channel RC helicopter, which would make for less soldering for most people. So kind of here you can see the core of the guts of everything. So we have two 8.5mm motors. These are from Micro Motor Warehouse. They're little coreless motors, the same motors that drive the ducted fans, but here they're driving the propellers off of a Hubsan quadrotor. I think it's the Hubsan X4. I'll put the link in the description for those as well. And those are putting out, each of these is putting out almost 30 grams of thrust. So I think the completed X-Wing weighs around 65 grams. So you have almost 1-to-1 thrust to weight, and that really, that probably makes the majority of the difference between this one and the stock one. You just have a ton of extra thrust, which allows you to kind of overcome the dragginess of the airframe and have it be much less marginal. Additionally, they're mounted on sticks in between the wings, so we're moving the thrust line back up to the center of the aircraft, so the aircraft doesn't change pitch attitude wildly when throttle changes now. You can just throttle up and use the ailerons for pitch. I'm using two 1.7 gram servos from Hobby King to drive the elevons, and I'm using hardware from any of the Park Zone micro ready-to-fly aircrafts with little tiny Z-bends that are just held in with a little piece of heat shrink. And then I've just cut free control surface at kind of using the end of the paint line as the starting point of it and the cord there, and then running that all the way out to the tip. It's beveled just using a razor blade on a 45 and then just scotch taped on to make the hinge. So I think you could probably, having flown this a bit, I think you could probably get away with just elevator and differential thrust control. The ailerons, they don't provide a ton of roll control, but the pitch control is the majority of the benefit from this setup. So pitch control is, almost, it's critical for any sort of smooth flying, and you're just not going to get it with, just differential thrust. So the actual receiver unit here is made by a British company called Deltang, and it's a Deltang RX34D, which is compatible with any Spectrum DSM2 transmitter. So like any of the hobby bind and fly transmitters will work with these little units. These have two brushed speed controls on them that can run the two motors, and it has built-in differential thrust on it. So I don't need rudders. I can use differential thrust just like the old plane used. A couple notes here. Always use kind of the thinnest wire that you can find to save weight. And then a trick I've learned for attaching motors to things is that you can just put a piece of heat shrink around the motor, shrink it down, and the heat shrink will glue pretty readily to any other surface. If you just try to glue the motor to the stick, the first thing you hit, it'll just rip right off because the CA doesn't bond very well. Yeah, so since the plane is all EPP foam, which is solvent resistant, you can use any regular CA to glue things together. I like to use Pacer Zap, the thick kind, because the thin will just wick into everything. But yeah, it's pretty simple on the inside. It's just a little receiver, the wiring to the two servos, these are the stock wire lengths they make it to the controller board, and then just the only soldering I had to do was to attach the motor leads to the receiver and to attach the battery lead to the receiver. Again, you could probably make this work with one of the little brick units out of any one of the bind and fly micro aircraft, but I like the Deltang products just because they're such a smaller form factor. They're much easier to work with, and they support differential thrust out of the box. So I just have the shell sitting on, these two shells are just sitting together, and then I use a couple of rubber bands around that to hold it together, so if it does whack the ground, it's free to move a bit, and it keeps things from breaking. The last bit, the stock X-Wing, for whatever reason I will never understand, does not fly with the laser cannons mounted to it, which just seems kind of like a travesty for, you know, something that looks so cool and it's such a, you know, large part of the way the thing looks. So I just used some bamboo coffee stirrers to make little fake super light laser cannons. I think you could probably, you know, cut down the stock one, so use the stock base and then put a carbon rod or something, and then use the stock little, you know, blast shaper piece up front. But these look good when the plane's, you know, 100 feet in the air. So that's about it. I'll put it all back together and kind of show you guys how the functions of everything work. But again, I'll include a link to a build thread on RC groups along with each of the components in there, which will show you some of kind of the more detailed shots, which are harder to get across. Okay, so I've got it all back together. As I said before, I'm just using a couple of elastic bands to hold the two shells together. I didn't glue them together just in case I need to get into electronics. So there's one there, rests on the back side of the canopy, one up front in front of the canard, in this case in front of the strake, and then I just stabbed a carbon rod through the back and then use an elastic around the back to hold everything together. But that holds the plane together well enough to, you know, test fly it, make sure that it works before you seal all your electronics inside there. I'm using one of the E-Flight 150 milliamp hour one cell batteries. These are the 45C ones. They work really nicely with the bigger motors. And then I just kind of, you know, bored a little hole through the fuselage to get the lead out there. Center of gravity for this, in this configuration with the cut down canard, I'm balancing right at the leading edge of the wing, whereas if you leave the canard on, which I would recommend if, you know, this is your first conversion, or, you know, if you just want a nice kind of relaxing flying aircraft, the CG in that case is basically right at the back of the canopy. So I have it bound up to my JR 9503. There's no special mixes in here other than, you know, regular Elevon mix. And you can see I've got a fair amount of reflex dialed into there, which gets rid of most of the camber on that top wing. And so if I pull up, they both go up. If I roll, you know, this side goes up, that side goes down. I'm running a fair amount of differential as well, which helps, you know, helps with kind of the adverse yaw that you get from that big giant nose hanging out there. And the whole plane is kind of pretty loose in yaw still, so using the differential aileron really helps it, you know, drag itself through the turns. So pitch, roll, and then yaw is again through the differential thrust. And then you can see here that it's pretty sprightly on those two 8.5 millimeter motors. Yeah, it's got almost 1-to-1 thrust, not quite, but it's much more thrust than the stock one. And then with the white props, once they're spinning, you can't really see them. So I think that overall it's not a huge detraction to switch from the ducted fans to the regular props, and it just provides so much more thrust. It's kind of a no-brainer. So that is my modified X-Wing. I'll link a video to the flying of it, as well as you know, links to the parts and links to the build thread on RC groups. But thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll be back pretty soon with another Star Wars build.